Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming back, hanging out with RAMO RETRAC. Hey, guys, I got another treat. I ran across this. It's going to be discussing the afterlife, near-death experiences, what to expect, what not to expect. I had a near-death experience when I was 27, and I don't talk about it. I don't talk about it because I don't want to mess up anybody else's spiritual path. I do like to listen to other people um, express what they saw. Um, and that's kind of what this guy's going to do. And I really like this guy. This interview is great because he looks at it from more of a scientific point of view. And so not only are you getting his experience, but you're also going to be, learning at the same time. So I want you guys to make sure you check it all out. Don't forget to hit that Cash App. I have decided to become the king of the $2 donations. For some reason, people like to donate $2 to me. I don't know what that's about, but I'll take it. Hey, it adds up, and I got a lot of videos, so hopefully everybody in the world will donate $2 to Ramo RedTrack. Um, but yeah, go ahead and hook your boy up. Keep me going with this because it's a challenge. When you really try and put up good content that makes sense to people and that people, because you don't always see 50,000 views on that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? So support me, keep me going. Um, And I'm going to go ahead and get this started and back on out the way. Hope you guys enjoy it.
Passion Ambassador, thank you so much for joining. So excited about my guest today, Anthony Peake. And if you don't know who a strictly scientific approach to his extensive studies of near-death experiences and the labyrinth of time. Anthony suggests that the past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. Anthony is an author, researcher, and speaker attempting to create a radically new approach to the mysteries of consciousness, perceptual reality, and non-ordinary experiences. He has lectured across the UK and has spoken at events in Europe, Australia, and North America. Anthony's first book, Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die, has now sold over 60,000 copies worldwide and has been translated into every major European language. Anthony has written 8 books, co-authored and co-edited a 10th. All of them develop his cheating the ferryman hypotheses into ever wider areas of application. His approach has always been to apply science to the mysterious. Anthony Peake attended Warwick University at the London School of Economics. He is a member of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the Scientific and Medical Network, and the Society for Psychic Research. This is his story and this is his passion. Anthony, welcome to Passion Harvest. I'm so honoured to have you on the show.
Absolutely. I've been looking forward to this. It's going to be a fascinating interview.
Welcome. It will be. I'm excited. So, I've written this down. What is the gateway to higher consciousness? What does that mean? And what is the gateway?
Well, I've argued long and hard. I've been quite fascinated for many years. Just a little bit of a background.
Sure.
I experience what's called classic migraine, and I have done ever since childhood. And in classic migraine, unlike ordinary migraine, you have what's called the aura sensation before you experience a headache. Now, in fact, I've not had a full migraine headache for about 30 years, but I still get the aura experiences. And the aura experiences are a form of altered state of consciousness, whereby your perceptions of the reality around you warp and change. Now, this has intrigued me. It has fascinated me because over the years, I've had a series of curious experiences whereby during aura state, I've had profound deja vu experiences. Also, during the aura state, I've had profound hypnagogic experiences. Now, by hypnagogic experiences, I mean waking dreams. They're as if you're in a scenario whereby reality changes around you and you find yourself somewhere else. I'll give an example of this. Many years ago, I was at work, working on a computer, and suddenly I found myself in a completely different place, and I was looking down at an old man reading a newspaper from a tree, from a vantage point of a tree, and I was looking down, and then I looked out and I could see a square in front of me, and I knew it was somewhere in Latin America, and in the distant side of the square there was the sound of a siren and an ambulance going round. Now, hypnagogica is quite strange in that you're perceiving it, but it's almost like it's in your periphery vision, and if you focus in on it, you'll lose it. Most people probably will identify hypnagogia as being that kind of liminal state just before you go to sleep, when you see faces in profile and you hear voices and everything else as well. That was such a vivid experience, and a few days later I had a similar one where I was what seemed to be like an animal, like a cat or something, looking through a glass table at an elderly woman drinking a cup of coffee. And then again, I lost it again. So these things have intrigued me for a long time. And in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I do an extensive analysis of altered states of consciousness from hallucinations right through. And I argue that using the term the doors of perception, which was first put forward in 1954 by Aldous Huxley in his book of the same title, I suggest, as Huxley did and as C.D. Broad did previous to that, and Henri Bergson, the famous philosopher, the French philosopher in the late 19th century, suggested that the brain acts as an attenuator. The brain is there, it's a reducing valve. It's there to take out information, not to put information in. So effectively, when our doors of perception are open, as William Blake, the British poet, said, when the doors of perception are open, we see the world as it really is, infinite. And I believe there are certain neurological conditions that effectively stop or affect the way in which the brain attenuator takes out the greater reality. And I argue these are classic epilepsy, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, autism, and various other neurological conditions that seem to stop the brain from doing this. And it opens up that consciousness to the greater consciousness, to the reality that sits in this reality, something I call the pleroma. And of course, from near-death experience to out-of-the-body experiences to lucid dreaming, these are all related phenomena. But unlike a good deal of the writers out there, I make it my duty to go out there and do the neurology, do the neurochemistry, do the structures of the brain that are facilitating these experiences. For instance, if we argue that the brain acts as what's it attenuating? What is it stopping? And in one or two of my books, I've argued that that is endogenous dimethyltryptamine. That is the hallucinogenic substance that I give evidence, as do a lot of researchers these days, that it's brain generated. The pineal gland excretes dimethyltryptamine and brings about altered states of consciousness.
So, my God, I could unpack that in so many layers, but we've only got probably an hour for this interview. Why is that the case? Why aren't we experiencing the fullity that we have the capability to through altered states of consciousness?
I would argue the reason we don't is because we're existing in a simulation. And the reality we see around us is an internal projection of what is going on inside our minds. Not only that, I argue that again, you can do the physics of this. Indeed, I was quite fascinated truly yesterday. The British very popular particle physicist called Brian Cox, Professor Brian Cox, announced on a radio program that it's highly likely that we're existing in a hologram. This has caused quite a sensation in the UK, by the way, because people are bouncing up and down because this guy is an arch materialist reductionist, and suddenly he's made this statement about the hologram. Now, again, this is typical of science at the moment. Science knows this. Science has been following this idea that reality is not what it seems for a long, long time.
Yes, it's nothing new.
It isn't, you know. And the thing is that if we are existing in a simulation, if we are sims within a simulation, if we become aware of the fact we're in a simulation, it causes issues and problems. So this is why We need to be in a state of what's called amnesis, which was a state that Plato first came up with, the Greek philosopher, when he argued that we're all in a state of forgetting who we really are. And we have to forget who we really are in order to function within this environment, within this brain-generated creation, something I call the phaneron, which is the brain-created reality that's around us. But we're co-creating this. You are, I am, we are all, it's not out there, but we are all creating it together. That's why it's called consensual reality. We consensualize this reality around us. And in many ways, we are manipulating the reality around us in one way or another. And again, this is going back to hard science, because there's something called the collapse of the wave function within quantum physics. There is something to do with the concept, or it's not a concept, it's a known fact, that subatomic particles, until they are observed or until they are measured, wave of information. So consciousness looks at something, and a wave of information suddenly becomes a visual field and a sensory field around us, if that makes sense.
Yes, I'm thinking so many things, but my God, your brain has so much information in it. So we control and manipulate our reality. Is this based on our thoughts? What controls my reality?
You do, and all of us do. There are two kind of feedback mechanisms going on here. One of the concepts I'm working on at the moment, I'm calling the egregorial. And what I mean by this, in my latest book, The Hidden Universe, I present the science for this. And the idea is that when we encounter things like entities, when you encounter a ghost, when you encounter a poltergeist, when you encounter voices in your head, they are being created by you, but they are not part of you, if that makes sense, mm-hmm. Which it probably doesn't. It's the idea that we bring these things into an existence. There is, in Tibetan Buddhism, there is a concept called the tulpa. And a tulpa is a thought form that is created by people concentrating on something. And again, there is strong evidence of this. There was a famous experiment that took place in the early 1970s in Toronto called the Philip experiment. And in the Philip experiment, a group of paranormal researchers created a ghost. They created an entity, which again became independent of them. And it's intriguing as to how there seems to be this feedback mechanism between what we want the world to be and what the world is. In my new book that I'm writing at the moment, I'm very fascinated about subatomic particles and how it is that science seems to anticipate the existence of a subatomic particle, and bang, it's there. I mean, there was a fascinating case many years ago when they discovered the muon, which is, by the way, the subatomic particle that all is about at the moment, about a new form of energy that is bringing a new force within the universe. And the muon was hypothetical. But scientists had never found it, but they visualized it should be there. And it turned up one day in the laboratory. And the guy that was the head of the laboratory was a guy called Isambard Isaac Rabi, who was a Nobel Prize winner, by the way, in physics. And Rabi's reaction to this was, when they found it, was, who ordered that? In other words, like you'd ordered a pizza. Right. It's as if you anticipate things and they come into existence. And throughout science, this has always been the case, right from the discovery of quanta way back in 1900 by Max Planck in Germany. Planck literally stated that his whole theory of quantum and quanta was an act of desperation. He couldn't make the maths work. He couldn't describe something called black body radiation. And he just came up with this out of his head idea that was crazy. And it wasn't crazy. Suddenly, as soon as a human being thinks about something, suddenly it's out there in reality. It's like a feedback mechanism in some way.
So almost like thoughts create things.
Well, it is. The basic point, the basic reality is thought. The basis of reality is consciousness. Consciousness is prime. Matter is created by consciousness, not consciousness created by matter. And this is one of the major issues of neurology. Indeed, in 1999, a young Australian philosopher by the name of David Chalmers stood at an event at the University of Arizona. And he turned around and he said, there are two great problems at the moment of science. And he said there's what I call the soft problem of science, which is how the brain functions and works. But the hard problem, which we're not even at first base of understanding, is how it is that chemicals reacting with fields within my brain and within Louisa's brain creates us, creates our hopes, our dreams, our anticipations. But not only this, how it creates things in the external world. One of the great mysteries of neurology is something called qualia. And I've been writing a section about this. So this is, no, I've never used this analogy before. It literally, I mystified a lot of people on Facebook and Instagram when I asked a question yesterday about certain chemicals. And I wanted to know whether these chemicals had taste or not. Sugar. Okay, sugar is something that you put in tea and everything else. And I'm a sugar addict, and that's why I was using the analogy. But if you break down sugar into its chemical constituents, you find out that it's made of three different elements: oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. Okay? Oxygen on its own is colorless and tasteless. It has no taste. So that's one part of the chemical structure. Carbon is the same. It has no taste and it has no color. The same goes for hydrogen. And yet you put these three together, and lots of those molecules together create sucrose, which is table sugar. Mm-hmm. And we taste the sweetness. But the sweetness is nowhere. The sweetness is not in the chemicals. There is no sweetness in the chemicals. Our brain creates the taste of sweetness, just like it creates the color red. The color red is not out there. There's no such thing as red. There's no such thing as green or blue. These are colors that our brain interprets certain vibrations in the electromagnetic field. And that's what color we see. But they're not out there. There is no color out there. It's a brain-created illusion. And qualia, again, is one of the great mysteries of how the mind works. So your brain is already presenting you and presenting to you this visual, do you know, the visual field you're looking at now? You know, you're looking out of your eyes now. Exactly, you're trying to look at me, looking at a screen or whatever. That you're seeing at the moment is created from signals on the back of the eye, the retina. The image on the retina is sized and inverted. That is then converted into an electrochemical signal, which goes to the darkest part of the brain, the back here, the visual cortex. There, something magical happens, whereby the brain magically turns that inverted image that's postage stamp sized into this three-dimensional surrounding you image that's full color and lively and vibrant. That's magic. That's as near as magic as you can imagine. And nobody can explain that. Nobody. They explain the process by which the signal is transferred, but they cannot explain how that does that. And indeed, the greater mystery then is that huge visual system is being created by the brain and presented to what? The observer in the head. So who's the observer in the head? How did the observer get there? Where did he come from? And this is what Chalmers argued. It's the hard problem of science. We're not even at first base understanding this. You know, science pretends it knows things. I call it the labeling theory of science. Because we give something a label and give it a nice Latin name or a Greek name, we will believe the scientists have got it right. I call it idiopathic science. The reason I call it idiopathic science is the word idiopathic. You go to your doctor, and your doctor turns around and says, you think you've got epilepsy. We've got a diagnosis. You've got idiopathic epilepsy. So you go away thinking, well, I'm concerned about that, but at least I know what I've got. Idiopathic means we haven't got a clue. That's what the word idiopathic means. Right. But doctors use this term all the time. It means we don't know. And this is the same with science. 94% of the universe is missing. We don't know what it is, so we call it dark matter. Then we have dark energy. We call it dark because we don't know what it is. But we stand around saying, oh, we know everything. We understand how the brain works. It's only a matter of time before we'll understand how the brain works. That's called promissory materialism. It's a promissory note. It's as if you're pretending that you're going to know in the future. It's pretense. You know, I will guarantee that in the next year or two, in the next few years, there's going to be certain scientific discoveries that's going to blow the lid off. You know, science works iteratively. Science works through revolutions. Science has a model until a new model comes along, and then that changes altogether. And our science is creaking at the moment. We don't understand black holes. How do black holes function? What are black holes? You know, we don't understand subatomic particles. We don't understand what subatomic particles are. We don't even know what electricity is. We're using electricity now in terms of this,
Yes.
what we're doing now. We know how to harness electricity. We don't know what it is. Idiopathic science.
More and more and more questions. So I'm just backtracking briefly back to our reality, and that we do create our reality. Are you suggesting that the more we actually believe something's there, the more energy we focus on it, the more it comes into our perception of what we call reality?
It does seem to be the case. It does seem to be the case. Philip experiment was a classic example of this, of how this group of parapsychologists got together, amateur parapsychologists, and created this entity called Philip.
What an incredible
And Philip started. Pardon?
Incredible experiment.
Oh, it was. They literally created a backstory to a guy called Philip Aylesford. But they gave him a fictional story. They said that he was an English nobleman living in the British Midlands in Warwickshire in the 1670s. They based him at a house that does exist. They made out that he was in a loveless marriage, and one day he met a gypsy woman. He was already an outsider because he was a Roman Catholic, and it was during the period to be Catholic in the UK. He falls in love with this gypsy woman. His wife finds out, and he commits suicide by throwing himself off the battlements of the castle. Complete fiction. They even did a drawing of him. Then what they did was they spent time just concentrating on him, trying to bring him into existence like a tulpa. And over a period of months, they started to get manifestations. They started to get raps on the table. And then the table started to levitate. Now, if anybody's in question about this, they actually went on television, on Canadian television, I think about 1972, and the table levitated in the TV studio. If you go on the video, you can see the video of the table levitating. It lifts a leg and then another leg. So clearly the collective consciousness of a group was creating, again, what I call the egregorial. It's a kind of, whenever you get a group of people together, well, you and I are now creating an egregore. Mm-hmm. With our enthusiasm, we are creating between ourselves a reality that's more tangible and more powerful. You put a large group of people together, the egregore gets bigger. I'll give an example of this. Fatima, with the Marian visions in 1917, I think it was, in Portugal. 3 children see what they think is the Virgin Mary. Thousands of people turn up, and one day they saw the sun spin in the sky. Thousands of people saw this. It's because they were anticipating and melding their reality. Egregores are something that's known in magical traditions for years. There's an American writer called Mark Stavish that's written a fantastic book on egregorials. And he says egregorials are things like socialism and Nazism and even advertising. The Coca-Cola sign is an egregore. These are all egregores that we creatively create that seems to become greater than we are. And I've always argued, when my little group meet together, and we spend hours discussing these things, which we do, well, unfortunately now on Zoom, but we used to do it over coffee. We feel that the rising power of what we're saying. Now, again, hallucinations, I'll give an example. Hallucinations, for instance. Hallucinations are another one of those things that nobody knows what they are. Yeah. They all turn around and they call it hallucination, and that's the explanation. Okay, so if I have an hallucination, the definition of an hallucination is something I see that nobody else sees. So therefore it's not real. Okay, so it's an hallucination. If me and a friend, if you and I both now see a UFO hovering outside the window, that's a folie à deux. And the explanation by the psychologists is that we are co-creating an hallucination. So in order to explain something they can't explain, they use something else they can't explain, because that suggests telepathy. Because how can 2 people co-create something from their own unless they're being telepathic? So this is the pathetic level that science will go. They will use telepathy to explain something they can't explain, when they can't explain telepathy. So, and then if a group of people, like at Fatima, see the same hallucinate.
You guys don't forget to scroll down, hit the go to the description box, hit the show more button, and then you'll see all of my Cash App information there. Like I said, I'm gonna become the best $2 donation YouTuber in the world. Support me, guys. I'm gonna keep bringing you great content, and you're gonna grow, and you're gonna become wiser.
It's called mass hysteria. So we've solved it. It's again labeling science. It's the idea we've solved it because we've given it a name. To me, this is far more important. It means that we can create things now, and this is something I'm working on my new book, and this is extraordinary. There is evidence that the act of observation, as I say, collapses the wave function, the statistical wave function of subatomic particles to bring them into existence. Known fact, scientifically reproduced many times. We know it happens. The question is whether it's just the act of observation, whether it is the environment collapsing the wave function, or whether it's the measuring device. But beside the point, ultimately, the ultimate observer is a human being or a consciousness. So if that is the case, how large are these particles? Are they just subatomic particles that this weird thing happens? If they're not, if you read most science books, they'll say it's subatomic particles. It doesn't matter. They're so tiny and inconsequential, things like photons and electrons. But they're doing it now with atoms and molecules. In fact, I recently saw a report about a molecule, I think, that has 280 atoms in it. That's a huge molecule that has this wave-particle duality that's brought into existence by the act of observation. Now, the larger ones, the larger molecules they're working on now, by my calculation, are 40% the size of a virus. Now, this starts to get creepy, because if we're already at 40% of the size of a virus, of objects that can be brought into reality by anticipating them,
yes,
what's to say viruses aren't created by our anticipations? What does that say about COVID? What does that say about a lot of things? We make these things come about because we somehow collectively create them. It's weird. It's weird.
And it's almost like a wave. It builds up the more and more people believe it and expect it. The power of co-creation.
We do. We anticipate things. We create our world around us as we go along. We co-create. There was a guy called John Archibald Wheeler, who was the PhD tutor for one of the most famous scientists of recent years, Richard Feynman, for example. And again, this is hard. This is, again, I talk hard science. I don't talk new age waffle. I talk hard science.
No,
and I say to people, go and check what I'm saying. Don't take my word for it. If I draw Richard Feynman in or John Archibald Wheeler, go and look them up. I'm not making them up. Well, maybe I actually.
Well, you.
But Wheeler, some of Wheeler's work was extraordinary, because Wheeler had a term he called the participatory universe. And this, again, is coming down to the fact of thought and anticipation. He actually did thought experiments that prove that the act of observation not only brings in subatomic particles into existence now, but brings in subatomic particles into existence from billions of years ago. So we can create our past and we can create our future. There are two types of waves in existence now. The guy called John Kramer, and again, look it up, it's called the transactional analysis, the transactional hypothesis of quantum physics. And this guy argues that there are two forms of waves. There are waves that go forwards in time, and there are waves that come backwards in time. When waves come together, they create an interference pattern. It's what causes holograms. Okay. Mm-hmm. He argues that the past, waves coming back in the past and waves coming from the future, create this reality at this point in time, and it moves forward. But the future is already there. The future is outside of this four-dimensional reality. The future in a fifth-dimensional reality that's outside of space and time. There is no time. Time is different. You can look at somebody's life from their birth to their death in once. Again, fascinating. If anybody's interested here, watch the movie Interstellar. In the Christopher Nolan movie.
This is one of my favorite subjects, by the way. Future, past, present, future, all happening at once.
Oh, good, because it does.
I'm in complete agreement with you.
You know, it's as the Quran says, these entities, these worlds are as close as the edge of your nose. You know, they are there. Okay, it's just that we don't perceive them. Okay, so reality then is time. Is time outside of time. It's called orthogonal time. It was put forward by Philip K. Dick, the American science fiction writer, was the first person to really use the term orthogonal. And all orthogonal means is something at right angles to something else. So orthogonal time, there's the time scale here, turning. Then there's an orthogonal time which runs as at a right angle away from it. So if you were there, you could see the whole of somebody's life. Okay. So time, when you're outside of time, you see it in a different way. Okay, now, when people take certain hallucinogenic substances, when they have near-death experiences, the report's standard, the Moody traits. And I know I saw you interview Ray Moody in one of your things. The Moody traits, you know, one of the Moody traits, one of the Grayson traits, is time slowing down. And time can slow down because time is subjective. Time is it's created by us. It's the only thing I know that's measured by itself. You can have a pound of apples, but you can only ever have a minute of a minute. And this is so important. People turn around and say, like Marcus Aurelius did, time is a river. Time flows. Moment's reflection. If time flows, what's it flowing against? If I look at a normal river, I can see the riverbanks, which will tell me the motion of the river. If you take the riverbanks away and you're moving with the flow, you can't see it because you're traveling with it. So you need another time to measure this time by. And a guy called John William Dunn, who was an Anglo-American aeronautical engineer in 1927, wrote a book called An Experiment with Time.
I've read it. It's a good book.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
So you know Dunn's theory, okay? And Dunn's theory is there are serial times, and each time is measured against the other time. And you can, when you're in sleep states, you can go into an altered state of consciousness whereby your brain moves into another form of time. And when you do that, you can experience precognitive dreaming. And you can recognize what's about to happen. Dunn was an amazing guy. Fascinating guy. I'm delighted to have an interviewer that has actually read.
Oh, yes. And I love how he started, because I think it was first he was sleeping and he imagined what the time was, and he looked at his clock, and then it was the right time, and he wondered how that was possible when his eyes closed. I think that was how it started.
And to remember, he had that amazing dream where he dreamt he was on a French-speaking Caribbean island, and people were coming to him in the dream, and they were turning around and saying, there's a huge earthquake.
Yes.
And a volcanic eruption the other side of the island. He said 4,000 people have died.
I think he saw a newspaper, didn't he? The newspaper.
That's right. Now, this is so important.
See, I did read it. I'm not just saying that to be nice.
You do. You obviously did. And what happened, and this is so important, that he was down in South Africa, 1902, covering the end of the Boer War. And it took a few days for newspapers to get down from London to where he was in South Africa. And the newspaper report on the day that he had the dream was announcing that there'd been Mount Pelée on the French-speaking Caribbean island of Martinique had exploded, and something called a nuée ardente, which is a glowing cloud, had come down, swept through the town of Saint-Pierre, and had actually killed everybody, except, funnily enough, a criminal who was about to be hung in a few days later, and he was in a cell below ground level, and the cloud went over, and he survived, which says some weird things, doesn't it? But what he said about this was intriguing. And the reason it was, he discovered something quite strange about this. Because many years later, he was talking about this dream, and somebody pointed out to him and said, do you know you got that dream wrong? Your dream was wrong. And he said, why? And he said, well, you said in the dream that 4,000 people had been killed. Do you know that it was actually 40,000? And he went back to the newspaper, and it was actually said 40,000. He had misread it. When he read the newspaper report, he misread it. And bing, a little light went on in his head, and he thought, I wasn't recognizing the event. I was recognizing reading about the event. I was being made aware of something in the immediate future, and my dream mind had created a dream based upon that, which is profoundly important. And it's central to my own hypothesis of choosing the ferryman, the idea that this is what happens.
So looking into the future events, we're looking at our reality, our perception of what we're experiencing. If we are individual units or sometimes co-creating as well.
Yeah, it is. I think that the great mystery is we're not thinking about it in the right way. You know, it's a horrible phrase, but thinking outside of the box. But the point of the matter is that we are so invested in our present materialist reductionist scientific model, we're missing the point. In the UK in the 1930s, there was a very famous illustrator called Heath Robinson. And Heath Robinson used to draw these incredibly ornate contraptions to make things happen. I'd argue that a lot of our science at the moment is Heath Robinson, in that it's painted itself into a corner and it can't get out. It's gone down a certain route, which is the materialist reductionist route, which is fine. In principle, breaking something apart in order to understand how it works is a perfectly reasonable principle. If I wanted to understand how my car works, I would take it apart and then find out all the bits work, put them together, and I'd realize how the internal combustion engine works. But you cannot do that with the brain. You can't do it with consciousness. You can't do it with experience, because it seems to be in reverse of this. You know, the brain is different. You know, the consciousness is different. Consciousness is non-physical, so you can't take it apart.
It's very hard to measure.
Pardon?
It's very hard to measure.
Exactly. And for years, the Western science wants to measure things and quantify things. And when you can't measure it or quantify it or repeat it, instead of saying we need to understand it, they just dismiss it. You know, Plato's cave, the famous Plato's cave, the idea that certain people have extraordinary experiences and we dismiss them. Instead of turning around and saying, well, what could have caused this experience, which is what I try to do, understanding hallucinations, and then trying to do the science of it. So in other words, I take people's accounts and then I say, right, okay, taking you at face value, you had this experience, and I've had various experiences in my life, and I'm sure you have, and I'm sure the listeners have. They need to be explained. For some scientists around and say that precognition doesn't happen is arrogance. I know it does. I have had precognitive dreams that have come true. I have precognitive deja sensations. These things happen, and I want to explain them. I don't want some scientists saying, my science can't explain it, therefore it doesn't happen. That's not science, that's scientism. That's a religious belief. If it doesn't fit my dogma, I'm ignoring it. I'm suffering from cognitive dissonance. It doesn't fit in, so I'm ignoring it. That's not the way forward. The way forward is within reason. If people experience things phenomenologically, we need to at least explore them. For instance, we know that near-death experiences happen. There is no doubt near-death experiences happen. My question is, but what are near-death experiences? Let's know that they happen. Out-of-the-body experiences happen. Veridical out-of-the-body experiences happen. I was not a believer in veridical out-of-the-body experiences till I was shown how they work, and indeed given evidence by a friend of mine, Graham Nichols, who you must have on the show, by the way, who had a precognitive out-of-body experience where he saw an event that was about to take place 5 days later, in detail, in the location, and he had witnesses to this. So he wasn't making it up. The question is, how does that happen? And my hypothesis, I believe, gives at least a structure based on science to explain it. There are too many books out there of people writing books on near-death experiences. Oh, I met Jesus. Oh, I did this. Elvis Presley appeared. And, you know, story after story after story. How many stories do you need to tell about the near-death experience? We don't need more stories about the near-death experience. We need to understand what's happening. Is the brain creating it? If the brain is creating it, what's going on in the brain? What neurochemicals are being reacted there? These hallucinations are real. What's the links? How can you guide who can give you information in a near-death experience, which you can then come back? Like Ibn Alexander with his sister that he didn't even know existed, that he sees on the wings of a butterfly in his near-death experience.
How is that possible?
Inexplicable.
Yeah. So what is your belief? I mean, obviously, we're much more than our physical body and our brain. What happens when this physical body dies?
When this physical body dies, Belief is a dangerous term to use.
Sorry.
Because I don't believe things until I've done the science to understand what's happening. What do I consider is taking place is that we're confusing when we talk about life after death. We are getting confused, and I think I'm the only writer that is suggesting this. The thing we are not taking into account here is time. I argue you cannot die in your own subjective time world. You are seen to die in other people's time world. So in other words, you die in somebody else's world. You die, your body rots, your brain rots. And the argument that you cannot perceive things without a functioning brain, I completely agree with. You can't. If your brain is dead, you can't do anything. But imagine the scenario that what happens at the point of death is that time itself expands. At the final millisecond of your life, time expands to accommodate another life, and then another life, and then another life. In which case then you are in smaller bits of time. Now again, there's in my new book, I'll be discussing the theories of a guy called Julian Barber. The idea again that there is a time behind time, again going back to the serial times we were discussing earlier, where time is an illusion. And Einstein said this. We turned around and he said time is an illusion, but an incredibly persistent one. It's because it's a subjective experience. So imagine that the moment before you die, you fall into another time scale. Call it the bardo state, or call it the limbo state. You know, the Buddhists were quite right about the bardo. You go into this other perceptual universe. And while you're there, you have all the time in the world to either, as I suggest, cheat the ferryman, which is going back and live your life again within the simulation.
As Louisa. So I'm always living as Louisa, not as a reincarnation. I'm always Louisa.
There's two factors here that's very important to differentiate. There's the many lives you can live as Louisa within the simulation, like you're in a third person computer game of your own life. Imagine that there's a program that contains every outcome of every decision that Louisa can ever make. Not only that, but there's a program that the other variations of Louisa that would exist in the multiverse, whereby your parents chose to go and emigrate to South Africa or America. There'd be a different Louisa. So they're all there, together with all the other opportunities where your parents, your grandparents, whether they met, whether they didn't meet, where they went. Suddenly it becomes huge in terms of the alternatives. That's the first thing. But there is also the collective unconscious. There's also the attunement you can do to what Jung called the collective unconscious, which I call, when I wrote my book with Irvin Laszlo has a thing called the Akashic field, which is the 0 point field. Everything is information. Within the program of the informational field, there is the racial memory of humanity. It's within our DNA. DNA carries data. Within your DNA is the DNA of humanity. So therefore, in the altered states of consciousness, when you die or when you're hypnotically regressed, you can choose to be Cleopatra. You can choose to be Hannibal crossing the Alps, because it's all there. It's all encoded. Because ultimately, and this is the most important point, ultimately, my hypothesis suggests that we are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. We are not individuated consciousnesses. This is not new. People like Alan Watts were saying it. We know it right through from the philosophy, from Vedanta and everything else, from the Kabbalah, from Sufism. The argument is, and you go back into the belief systems, we are all just a dream of Brahman. We are everything. You know, within religious beliefs, it says, find the God within, find the Christ within.
Yes.
The Christ within is what I call the daemon, which is your part of you that's part of the greater something. And we can then attune into that greater something, in which case we can have reincarnations. And this is how reincarnation works. For me, reincarnation, people think I dismiss reincarnation because of cheating the ferryman. I don't. They can run parallel. They don't have to be exclusive. But nobody explains reincarnation. Everybody goes on, oh, you die, and you choose a new life, and you go and you live that. Great, but where's the explanation for it? Where's the science? I'm the only writer doing this, I think, in the world, saying, great, let's do the science. Let's take the science back to the skeptics. Let's take it back and say, well, what is the point field? What if it's the informational field? DNA itself has codons in it, has 4 codons within DNA that are annotated by different letters. It's a digital code. It's a digital code in exactly the same way as it's a digital code in your computer. So every piece of DNA in your body has a digital coding, has digital information. Not only this, but every neuron in your brain has things in it called microtubules. And these microtubules are so small, quantum effects can take place within them. These are the things that create reality. Within your brain, there's something called the glial cells. You know, when people turn around and say that 90%, we don't use 90% of our brain, people use that statement all the time. They don't know what it means. What it means is that 10% of your brain is neurons, 90% are glial cells. They found something called a calcium wave that goes across the brain at unbelievable speed. This is because neurons are not where the brain functions properly. It's the glial cells. There's a guy called Andrew Glure that's been writing about this for quite a few years. This explains something called the binding problem. How is it that you have a feeling of simultaneity now? You're looking out of your window. Like say, you're looking out your window and you see a bouncing red ball. Mm-hmm. That's impossible because red is processed in one part of the brain. The bouncing movement is processed in a different part of the brain, as is all else you're seeing in your visual field. They are in relative terms, great distances in the brain. And yet you feel instantaneously. The brain, according to the neuronal theory, I think it's about 700 feet per second. I think the electrical signals in the brain work. There's not enough time for that coming together. It's called the binding problem. But if the brain works non-locally, and I haven't got time here to go into the physics of this about non-locality, but it's another known physical effect where 2 particles can communicate instantaneously. Effectively means if the brain works non-locally, it works holographically. And this is how we can draw up memories quickly. And the holograms themselves are part and parcel of the computer model I'm talking about that overall reality is. Now, if that all made sense.
It does. Oh my God, I'm going to have to listen to this interview quite a few times. It certainly does. I just want to clarify one thing with you. There's infinite probabilities of choices from any choice I can make or my family makes that I'm living at some point in space-time.